And today we're going to be talking about near-death experiences. Father, great to see you again.
Great to see you, Doug.
You know, it's interesting, too, because talking about Mother Angelica herself actually spoke of having a near-death experience, and I remember her talking to us about it. And the fact was, I did see how it did impact her life. Now, have you yourself known anybody specifically or personally who's had a near-death experience?
Oh, yes, I definitely have. In fact, I'm going to be seeing one of them right after the show today. So, yes, as a matter of fact, I have several, actually.
Very good. And, you know, it's because it's interesting, too. People might say, are we crossing over from the whole idea of science to theology when we're talking about near-death experiences? But I don't think that's your intention necessarily. We're talking about the scientific aspect here as well, right?
Yes, we are, and definitely there is a good deal of science and a good deal of medicine that's involved in it. You know, there are really several excellent studies that have been done. Bruce Grayson's studies are very good. The Samuel Parnia study from 2014 at the University of Southampton is an excellent study in England there. That was 2016 patients over multiple hospitals around Europe and England. That's a very good. Dr. Pim van Lommel's study that was published in The Lancet is also a very, very fine study, and that one is about a 2001 to 2003 study, and again, multiple hospitals over the Netherlands and England, and then there are a variety of other studies that have been done. Janice Holden's study is very good, and they're actually in a book I wrote called The Soul's Upward Yearning. If you read chapter 5 there, you'll see you know, a lot of references to about 15 different very, very fine studies that have been done either at a university or at several hospitals, you know, published in peer-reviewed journals and with really good, you know, scholarly and research apparatus. So there's quite a bit of scientific, you know, control, medical control, and peer review that's been involved in a lot of these studies.
We've been talking about the evidence of God's existence. Now we're talking about near-death experiences. How do you see the recounting of near-death experiences relate directly to the evidence for God's existence? I mean, maybe it's the evidence that there's another sphere or another plateau, but how does that relate to God?
Well, it does in a couple of different ways. I mean, the first thing is, you know, there's considerable evidence for the survival of our consciousness, of our self-consciousness after bodily death. And the reason that evidence is very good is because during a near-death experience, what's reported is that like almost a spiritual body, if I can call it like a soul-like body, leaves the physical body. And when it leaves, it actually has the capacity to see, the capacity to hear, the capacity to think, to reflect, to remember past memories. In fact, people who have had a lot of dementia or memory problems, when they actually leave their bodies, seem to have a great deal more lucidity for a time, you know, and you know, they can recall from their own experience when they're back, even in a dementia state, they can sort of recall that lucidity. So there's a great deal of clarity, you know, that they have about their past selves. Now, what's interesting in the midst of all of this is that, you know, there's veridical evidence that these people can report, and so that is really important. So highly unusual facts that are reported. So somebody can report, for example, that there's a tennis shoe sitting out on a ledge of the third floor of a hospital that has a shoelace tucked underneath it and a left toe that's worn down. The researcher goes out, crawls along the ledge of the hospital, and there's the tennis shoe exactly as reported. Or, you know, the fact that, you know, 80% of blind people can see during a near-death experience. I mean, these are blind people who are, most of whom whom are blind from birth, right? So they've never had a visual image before. They can do comparative shape analysis and comparative color analysis. For example, you know, the color of that nurse's hair is the same as the color of the shoelace of this other nurse, or whatever the case may be. And of course, how in the world could a blind person, they may not know that the color is red,
right,
but they know it's the same color, and obviously they can give proof of the fact that they have, you know, some visual index, you know, whereas before they had nothing. Now, you can't drum that out of your imagination. If you haven't seen anything before, you're not going to drum a visual image out of your imagination. And these are some of this vertical evidence and some of this, evidence of blind people seeing. It's so, well documented now, right? That at this juncture, you know, all the typical explanations like, oh, this is a hallucination, or this is the final throes of the brain before death, or this is some kind of adverse stimulation of the temporal lobe, or this is anoxia, a deprivation of oxygen. All these typical things completely fall apart because, of course, hallucinations or anoxia don't give rise to accurate veridical perceptions. And by the way, even the stimulation of the temporal lobe, right, that's not going to, if you don't have an image of color or an image of shape or comparative colors or comparative shapes in your brain, what image can your physical brain project onto this near-death experience? The answer is none. So, of course, it couldn't be attributable to a stimulation of the temporal lobe in the brain or any other part of the brain for that matter. So all these typical explanations fall apart. And so the first thing you have to say is, hey, there's a lot of very good veridical data for the survival of our self-consciousness, our visual perception, auditory perception, etc., after death. And the studies go much deeper than this. I'm giving you the grand summary here.
Right,
but the second part, which is really important too, is that a lot of people go to the other side, right? So a lot of people just don't stay in the waiting room on this earth, as it were. A lot of people don't just, go outside the hospital and see tennis shoes, or go into the waiting room and hear, what somebody is saying about them. By the way, never speak badly about the dead.
That's right, you never know,
so,
right?
of course, you never know. He might be I'm telling you, there's a lot of incidents of this. So, in any case, but a lot of people go to a whole new sort of transphysical domain, and there are four common, experiences that are reported. Number one, this new domain, this heavenly domain that they go to, is exceedingly beautiful, right? So they report that, they don't feel any more physical pain, they don't feel any more emotional pain, but they're immersed, bathed in a kind of a beauty when they get there. Then the second thing that they report very typically is that deceased relatives will meet them. Sometimes deceased friends, but only in about 5% of the cases. Vast majority of the time it's deceased relatives who meet them. Sometimes they're relatives they have never met before, or relatives who might have died when they were children or before they were born. And so, of course, they're meeting these relatives for the first time, but they come and they meet them, and these relatives are clearly already imbued with the kind of love and transcendence that, they look beautiful, they appear at great peace, they're exceedingly loving, and they're discussing things with the person who's kind of on the verge of moving to the other side. And sometimes, obviously in all the cases we know about, the person decided to come back. But there's generally some kind of a choice that's there if the relative is there, or the relative is there to tell them simply, it's not your time, there's no choice, you're going to go back, and you may not want to go back, but you're going to go back. A lot of people will choose to go back simply because they have children or some elderly relative or somebody that they're caring for that they want to go back for. for. But then a third typical experience is, they will see a loving white light. And the loving white light is it's so loving that it literally is bathing this person in love. There's no other experience that they can compare it to, right? These are very often reported by people who are doctors, right? Who are psychiatrists, right? Dr. Eben Alexander, for example, had his own near-death experience, among others, right, who report this kind of data. And of course, they just say, I have no way of telling you why I experienced it. And well, who did you think it was? The vast majority of the time, they think that this intensely loving white light is God. Sometimes people will say it's Jesus, and sometimes they will say it's an angel or something of that nature, but generally they will say it is God himself. And then, of course, the fourth experience, which is often happens with children, right? And by the way, children who undergo clinical death, 85% of them have near-death experiences.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
And the
okay.
vast
Wow.
majority of those are, and they're very, very positive near-death experiences. But what I was going to say is that they also see Jesus. So Jesus appears frequently in their near-death experience when they cross over to the other side. But of course, all of them return to their bodies, and when they return to their bodies, they're changed for life. I mean, essentially, you have another kind of veridical data that's there because they don't experience death anxiety anymore. And by the way, religion doesn't control death anxiety. So a very spiritual or religious person who even has a lot of confidence, in God and confidence in the resurrection, confidence in Jesus, still will experience, maybe a slightly lower amount of death anxiety. But to experience no death anxiety, that seems to be universally peculiar to people who have had a near-death experience. And by the way, even if they had a near-death experience as a child,
Right.
that absence of death anxiety persists right into their 30s or 40s, and this is monitored and tested as they move along in their life. It just, you can even, do the equivalent of a modified polygraph, and you can see that these people just simply don't have the normal near-death.
Let me ask you a question.
In fact, they don't have.
Let me ask you
any.
a question here, Father, and we talked about, and kind of the descriptors you just had there are the ones we hear are very, very positive, et cetera. Some people have been concerned that somehow that everybody sees the white light and everybody sees Jesus and the neighbors and everything's going to be wonderful regardless of what that person might have lived their life as. And some people claim, well, could this be a deception that's trying to make people think that how you live this life doesn't matter? The other question I have for you is, why would it not be somebody's time? If they get to that part and that point, why would it not be their time? If it wasn't their time, why did they get to that point? Any ideas?
Yeah. Great two questions. With respect to the first, I don't doubt the reports of the people that are experiencing this, and I have to tell you, I do not see any demonic entity curing people from pain, taking away all of their emotional pain, loving them intensely, even in the most false kinds of consolation, one can sense the presence of darkness. The demonic spirit is not going to love somebody into a kind of a heavenly state. It's just not within their capacity as a dark being. So no, I don't think it's a deception. However, one has to be very careful about not jumping to that conclusion. In other words, a conclusion that it doesn't matter how you live your life. And why so? Now, as I said, 85% of children who undergo clinical death have a near-death experience, but only about 10 to 20%, probably near to 20% of adults have a near-death experience. And so you have to ask yourself the question, what about the other 80%? I mean, they're clinically dead too. They have fixed and dilated pupils too. They have a flat EEG too. They've also, got an absence of gag reflex too. I mean, they're clinically dead. Their brain is essentially sputtering on almost nothing. I mean, for all intents and purposes, so why shouldn't we think that they too, would have a near-death experience? But they don't. And so, of course, for Catholic theology, we go, well, maybe people who are, destined for purgatory, right, are still, as it were, not going to experience this fullness of the white light or God. Maybe there is something for them to do still, some final purification, which they are going to have to undergo, and they just simply have no experience of it. The second thing to remember, too, is 1% to 2% of people who do have near-death experiences do have negative ones.
I was going to ask you that.
And the negative ones are dark. Yes.
Okay, 1 or 2%.
And they are
okay.
dark indeed. Yeah, 1% to 2% have negative ones, and they're very dark experiences indeed. So I mean, there's almost an immediate judgment, and of course some of these things are associated sometimes with willful suicides, not suicides out of depression, but kind of a I'll get even with you and commit suicide kind of a thing. Some of these things are associated, but oftentimes it's really hard to make a study of 2% of people. You don't have a significant enough database. But it's the real question is, what about those 80%? Why don't those adults have the near-death experience when the children do have the near-death experience up to 85%? How can we explain that 65% differential? Does it have something to do with our view of purgatory? My personal opinion is it does.
I see.
But of course I couldn't scientifically prove that to you, but I would suspect that it does. And so, and I would suspect that some of those people are going to have negative experiences, or maybe they did have negative experiences which were so unpleasant that they literally repressed them. And that's a possibility that several of the authors of these studies also consider. So that there is unpleasantness about it that's repressed.
Very good, very good. We're at a near break experience here. We got to take a break. We have a lot of questions coming up after the break. Speaking here with Father Robert Spitzer, live from California, our California studios, here on Father Spitzer's Universe. Your questions straight ahead. Stay with us. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'm Doug Keck with Father Robert Spitzer. We go right to your questions for Father Spitzer. Dear Father Spitzer, so much is indicated in the scriptures about God our Father and light. It is shown to us in scripture that God dwells in unapproachable and inaccessible light. We know that light speed is a constant throughout the universe, and that the closer we come to light speed, the less we age in time. It may indicate that by achieving or somehow passing light speed, we would stop aging altogether. Might it indicate that beyond the speed of light is a heavenly realm? And this is Butchie from California. Interesting. Little Star Wars is in there, and but might relate to a lot of our audience there. We're talking about jumping to light speed here, Father.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, when you go faster than the speed of light, there's been a lot of talk about, well, would a person then actually go backward in time, something of that nature. But actually, I wrote a whole dissertation on this, and the answer really is no. You actually go back in the measurement of time. Yes, the clock would go backwards. universe, but you would not be going back into, as it were, a past scene. So the first thing is we don't want to get
Would the person get younger? Would that person get younger? Or
actually, no, actually, it would just reverse all of the directions of, the molecular flow or the atomic flow or the atomic vibration in your body. But it really, in terms, probably, I hate to say this, but kind of dissipates you rather than make you younger. But for all intents and purposes, though, you would already be, if they accelerated you to light speed, you'd be vaporized into pure energy. So, you wouldn't have to worry about getting beyond it because there would be no you left. So,
good point.
And good point. So, but the main thing is, we don't want to confuse, a reality that we know of in physics with something that is metaphysical or transphysical, because of course, what happens in the transphysical domain is essentially not regulated by physical laws. So, I mean, once we pass over into this other domain, right? Remember what I was saying a few weeks back, about the whole universe being a thought in the mind of God. Remember, I'm saying this analogically, right? I'm saying this as an analogy, but in the unrestricted act of thinking of God's consciousness, right? The universe is but one thought, right? And of course, heaven is a whole other thought. And of course, when you move from, as it were, one realm to another, one thought to another, if I can use the analogy, right? There's no necessary correlation or relationship, between the laws of one thought and the other thought. So between one realm and another realm. So I would probably sort of lay off of the parallelism between, physical laws and activity, even, getting to light speed or beyond light speed and applying it to a heavenly realm. I think God literally issues or ushers us in some way from the domain we are at to another thought, as it were, another domain in His mind, and I think we move into that heavenly realm, and it is distinct. But it always is interesting, to see sometimes the symbolism of light is so pervasive. I agree with you, because of course light, it has a purity to it. It also, in physics, it is that from which everything else, as it were, is born. The kind of the energy that is kind of at the base of everything in the universe, at least visible matter in the universe. And of course, it is a symbolic representation in Christian scripture and Judeo-Christian scriptures, even of God's presence. It is kind of interesting in the Shroud of Turin, which is something we'll discuss at a later point. There's some rather interesting evidence, that for a brief moment, right, for 1/40 of a second, the corpse, which I believe is the corpse of Jesus, right, the dead body of Jesus, actually emanated for 1/40 of a second enough ultraviolet, it's called vacuum ultraviolet radiation, a very, very short-lived but intense kind of radiation. Ultraviolet radiation is a very intense kind of radiation, but vacuum ultraviolet radiation is a very short-lived radiation. But it emanated that 1/40 of a second, several billion watts of radiation. This is the only way of producing the rapid dehydration that gave rise to that three-dimensional photographic negative image on the Shroud of Turin. But the only way we've been able to produce it right now is with an excimer ARF laser in a laboratory, but it would take 14,000 of those lasers to produce that image at a magnitude of several billion watts for 1/40 of a second. Now you tell me how a dead a body does that, except maybe when it's in a transitional state to a transphysical state. And so there you might have that analogy liturgy work, right? I mean, I think, there's a little relic of Jesus' resurrection right on the cloth itself. And of course, it is the light that does it. It's not, it can't be done by heat. Obviously, you just burn the cloth in 1.5 seconds. So you have very short-lived radiation, but it's done by the light itself, which causes this rapid dehydration.
Speaking of short-lived, we only have so much time in the show. We got a lot of questions to get to. So here's one that I wanted to pull to you next. Comes to us via email. Dear Father Spitzer, for over 40 years now, I have been experiencing premonitions of when people are going to die or immediately after they have died. These are not people I knew were dying or were told were sick or died, except for one recently. Okay? Some have been very strong and could vary in the kind of premonition, though most are just a strong sense of the person for a number of days. One actually was so strong I knew when the death occurred within 2 to 3 hour time frame of that death. They were stronger and more frequent when I was younger. What's your opinion on why these happen? God bless this wonderful program, Janice. Hopefully she doesn't have any particular premonitions about either one of us. So go ahead, Father.
Well, thank you, Janice. But yeah, I would say some people are just simply sensitive to these kinds of things. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself particularly sensitive, to somebody's passing. But I mean, I think there is a real spirit that comes out of a person, as I was just describing it a few minutes ago. I do think there are people who are sensitive to those kinds of things. I don't think that spirit is subject to the laws of physics, right? So, for whatever reason, you can go through walls, you can go up and down, you don't necessarily have to be located in a hospital, etc. But I think that people are sensitive to these things. I myself have been close to people who have died in a hospital when I was doing a little hospital chaplaincy before, just after my ordination, before I kind of got into graduate studies. And I have to tell you, on a couple of different occasions, I absolutely sensed that the person had left their body, almost as if something had just passed right through me, like a little pulse of electricity, and sure enough, that person, was deceased. But the point is, some people are just sensitive, and you're probably one of them. And if you're asking me why it is that you, among so many others, are have this kind of sensitivity, I don't know. I just figure, well, that's God's way of giving us each some kinds of gifts. I mean, there are just some people, I'm telling you, they are sensitive to even sometimes the condition of somebody's soul. I mean, Padre Pio, I mean, the guy could, sense it. One time I was actually debating a guy on assisted suicide, and, before the debate, I shook the guy's hand, and I just actually just felt like I was just going to be bolted backwards,
Really?
Because I felt like, oh my gosh, I just, felt a presence that was not, commensurate with my own, and I just thought, oh my gosh, and I thought, did I talk myself into this, but I've never done that with a debate opponent before, so I don't know what it was, but every once in a while, I've had a couple of experiences like that, but Janice, just not like your own. So but I do think sometimes you can sense a presence that you just know, stay away from that person, or sometimes you just know, I want to be around that person, and it's quite mystifying, and there is no real scientific or physical test for it. It's just it's very we're spiritual beings. And I totally believe that.
And the best thing,
therefore we have spiritual sensitivities.
Right, and the best thing you can always do is pray. Right, pray for that person when you think of them, or you feel like something's coming on. Pray for them. For their health, pray for them, for their spiritual well-being, etc. So, next up for you, Father Spitzer, this must be a friend of yours from Dallas, because he's plugging your book, God So Loved the World, Clues to Our Transcendent Destiny, from the Revelation of Jesus. And the question is good afternoon. It says good morning, but I'll change. Good afternoon, Father Spitzer. This is an email. In your book, God So Loved the World, you discuss a correlation between the new transphysical form of near-death experiences and Jesus' risen appearance. Could you please elaborate on this? And you were kind of talking about that with the Shroud of Turin, right?
Yeah, I would just say, there are a couple of, different things. The first thing, of course, is Jesus has a glorified transphysical form. The persons in near-death experiences, they're not glorified yet. But they do have a transphysical form, so there is actually a difference. But the fact is, N.T. Wright did a study of, what's called Second Temple Judaism, and the Second Temple is, lasted from about 500 B.C. To just after the time of Jesus, and during that time, a series of kind of doctrines sort of informally developed. And one of those doctrines was the fact that when you were raised from the dead and the general resurrection of the dead, Jewish people believed that it was going to be a resuscitation kind of my physical body. I mean, it would now be incorruptible, but it would basically be like my physical body is now. Now, of course, the Christians who didn't want to deviate at all from Second Temple Judaism, the Christians themselves deviated completely from that Second Temple Judaism doctrine, and they started claiming, no, our bodies are going to be a pneumatikon soma, right? It's going to be a spiritual body. So, and Paul uses that specific word. And of course, because our bodies are going to be like the body of the risen Jesus. So when the apostles saw the risen Christ, he wasn't just like a physical body made incorruptible. He's now a spiritual and glorified body. But what Paul goes on to say is we're going to be like him. So we're going to have this spiritual body. We're not going to be subject to physical laws. And this is precisely one of the parallels we find with near-death experiences. People who are in that spiritual form after they've left their body, honestly, they can go right up to the roof. They can go to the 14th floor of the hospital and go up to the roof. They can pass right through walls of the hospital, walls to the waiting room. Remember what I said, don't speak badly of the dead. So the key thing is, of course, when you're in that state, you are not subject to the laws of physics, even when you are still in the world. Right. Now, that is clearly a correlation with Jesus, but of course, there are other things where we don't correlate, and that other thing is that Jesus was glorified. He was beautiful. He was, when he appeared, it was like, people thought they were seeing God, right? I mean, they bowed down and worshiped, right, in Matthew's gospel. And of course, that word is only used of God, right? The devil asks Jesus to do that of him, but of course Jesus says, no, you shall worship the Lord your God, him alone shall you serve. But the key thing is that word is used very rarely, but in the description of Jesus' appearance to the disciples are bowing down and worshiping. So there's something very much beyond, we share the transphysical experience, but we don't share the glorified part of that experience.
Okay.
But great question.
Very good. Next, a question coming up. Before I get there, I just wanted to read this other question about a near-death experience where somebody was on our website, on our EWTN, EWTN.com forum. They were talking about near-death experiences and understanding them from the church's perspective, and this dovetails into the question I'm going to read after this, the idea of by having this kind of experience, this person says, does the Catechism of the Catholic Church address, or is there a church teaching on the theology of near-death experiences? It would seem that Jesus is offering us yet another olive branch against our stubborn doubt in these modern times with near-death testimonies. Now, this other person's question also was, the idea was, if we're supposed to die once and then be judged, how do we have a near-death experience and go back? Why aren't we judged at that time? So put those two together. If you can.
Good. Well, Yeah, two really good questions. With respect to the first question, is this? I totally agree. Yes, it is God giving us, as it were, the olive branch. One more testimony against the stubborn materialism of our times. I couldn't put it any better than that. The Catechism doesn't have specific teachings on near-death experiences, but what I try to do in that book, The Soul's Upward Yearning, is I give you a fairly good description of it, and then try to give you the parallels with Christian theology in that other book, God So Loved the World. So if you just go to the chapter on Jesus' resurrection, I try to pull out those parallels. But the main thing I would say, there's another parallel besides the transphysical part of our souls, and that is, Jesus talks about a resurrection into unconditional love, and that resurrection of unconditional love is absolutely verified in near-death experiences. So the Christian view there of the resurrection as unconditional love is very much verified. So yes, I do think there's some really excellent parallels there. The one thing I would just say, watch out with the anecdotal descriptions of near-death experiences. There are a lot of people out there who honestly are using these things in a very manipulative way. By anecdotal, I mean a single story, right? So somebody tells you, I had a near-death experience and here's the story. I would say, fine, believe that story. I mean, a trustworthy friend, that's a great thing. But always, have a little bit of caution in you, particularly if you start hearing something that just sounds really goofy, contrary to Christian doctrine. There could be, honestly, a very manipulative or even New Age agenda that's kind of, underlying, that anecdotal thing. Stick with the science. Stick with the peer-reviewed studies. Stick with the studies from lots of hospitals that are published in peer-reviewed journals. They have excellent research apparatus connected with them, that have very fine, reputable doctors that are speaking about this with a team of other doctors who are testifying not only to what happened, but how it happened. If you stick with the good studies, you're not going to get too misled.
Right.
Watch out for some of these anecdotal ones, and especially when you hear something, that's just wacky,
Right. Exactly.
Just chalk it up to, I'm being manipulated by, the source of the wacky story, perhaps a wacky person. So, or a manipulative person who may have something else in mind. But no, the Catechism doesn't really speak to it.
Okay.
But if you go to that chapter 4 of that book, God So Loved the World, there are a lot of parallels there for you. So
sounds good.
What was your second question?
Well, we're gonna come back to that second question because we're gonna take a break and mention about your two books. You just mentioned about God So Loved the World, but the first one we wanted to mention, New Proofs for the Existence of God, Contributions of Contemporary Physics and Philosophy, EWTNRC.com. All of Father Spitzer's books are there. Very important when you're dealing with what we are on this show, the evidence of God's existence, near-death experiences. And again, just to mention, God So Loved the World, his latest book, Clues to Our Transcendent Destiny from the Revelation of Jesus. Much more ahead here with Father Spitzer right after this short break. Stay with us. And I'm Doug Keck here on Father Spitzer's Universe, kind of directing traffic, and just wanted to mention before we got back to Father Spitzer, as we're talking about evidence of God's existence, near-death experiences, a wonderful book, Mother Angelica's Answers Not Promises. One of the things at the back of the book, it says, ways to overcome the difficulty in believing in God, and why there is a heaven and what you'll do there. Some interesting topics from Mother Angelica, EWTNRC.com, in her own words, a classic book, Answers Not Promises. Let's go to Father Spitzer because we're talking about these topics. Right, Father, next up, another email. Many Catholic teachings have parallels in scientific discovery. It has occurred to me to think of death as being parallel with the concept of, quote unquote, what's called an event horizon. That is the event horizon around a black hole, that each soul upon death of its, I'm waiting for it to move ahead, physical body, let's see, physical body crosses an equivalent of an event horizon. I'm caught in a black hole here, a kind of wormhole out of this physical universe into heaven, purgatory, where I am right now, or hell. From an early earthly perspective, time seems to have stopped for that dead person, okay? Crossing this interior event horizon. On the other hand, the dead person's soul, having crossed the event horizon to heaven, purgatory, or hell, accelerates to the speed of light, where time no longer has meaning, time is eternal and one. This is Barbara from Seattle. I think I'm trapped in one of those wormholes right now. If you followed that question, you win a Koopy doll. Go ahead, Father.
I know. Well, no, actually, the question's a very intelligible question, Barbara. I mean, there are some, instances, where if you are accelerated to the speed of light, for sure, time would stand still inside that perspective. But of course, the problem is you are vaporized as a physical entity. Now, if you want to really be careful, though, and same thing within the event horizon of a black hole, right? And by the way, time wouldn't stand still at the event horizon of the black hole, but that's a technical thing that we can talk about later. But the main thing that you want to do is be very, very careful, again, about making analogies between what's going on in the physical domain and closely paralleling it with something that is obviously transphysical, in the domain. You don't want to say that the spirit form that's leaving, right, the body of a person who's clinically dead, is being accelerated at the speed of light, or is in a wormhole when it's sitting there in the operating room. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to say that it's going through a wormhole when it moves to that other domain, because of course, as you probably know, when you go through a wormhole, you'll come out somewhere else, either in the physical universe, or you'll come out somewhere else on another side of a black hole, mm-hmm. maybe to a white hole or something of that nature in the same physical universe. So you're really not making the crossover to a true transphysical domain, which is what these people report and what Jesus promises in the next life. So I mean, again, I would go back to the way I would view, the best and safest way is to look at God as an unrestricted act of understanding, an unrestricted act of thinking, right? Again, separate that off from Donovan's brain for a moment, and just think of it as, an unrestricted act of thinking, and that there's actually two thoughts which are restricted in their parameter, that of the whole physical universe, that of heaven, and of course that God is the one that moves us through his own good agency from the thought of this universe to the thought of a heavenly one, without any necessary parallelism between the two. Mm-hmm. Now, you can have all kinds of interesting analogies between here and there, like the analogy of light is clearly present, but you don't want to equate physical light with the transcendent light, that you're seeing in this heavenly domain. That's a completely different thing, and so you got to really be careful. There's of course the appearance of that, effulgence, the appearance of, to us, a spiritual translucency and mm-hmm. effulgence, yes. But, you don't want to go too much beyond our own perception of a similarity and say there's some sort of equation between physical reality and heavenly or transphysical reality. Best to keep the two domains
right.
separate, and keep God as the agency that's enabling us to move from one to the other.
Right. Well, I'm happy you understood it and gave us a clear answer there. Now let me get to the question I probably was supposed to ask you. This is another one. This one's via Facebook. When I had a service-related injuries in the Navy, I spent 8 hours in surgery mm-hmm. where I was told that I had died 3 times. I remember leaving my body on a table and going to a white wormhole. That's how they describe it. Then my mother came out and said, "Go back, it's not your time." What do you think of this experience? And this is from Richard. Well, I guess the question is whether it was a wormhole or not, but he had this experience. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, aside from my own explanation, I wouldn't call it a wormhole. A wormhole is a technical, word or concept that's being used to refer to something in the space-time continuum, right, in the physical universe. So I wouldn't call it a wormhole. It might have seemed like one, but I would just rather call it, some kind of a white domain that seemed to be some sort of a transitional phase from the physical universe to the transphysical one. Do I believe that such an experience happens? Oh, all the time. I mean, we literally have thousands upon thousands of documented cases of experiences that very much resemble what you're talking about, from the moving out of your own body to most of the time it's moving through a dark tunnel, but not inconceivable that it could be a white tunnel, but you come out on the other side into a white domain, a transphysical domain that looks white, and having your mother meet you happens all the time. I mean, I shouldn't say it's like an everyday experience like going out and eating a lunch, but it happens to a lot of people in a lot of documented cases, and that's very typical of the deceased relative to come to you and say, it is not your time, and to go back. And that's very, very typical.
Right.
So yes, I would say you probably had something akin to a very authentic experience.
Let me ask you, Father, we were talking there before we go to our next question earlier about the idea of kind of that individual experience versus being tested scientifically. How do we think of things like St. Philip Neri dealt with a particular prince who claimed he had a near-death experience and wanted to go to live in heaven with his family? St. Catherine of Siena and St. Faustina had visions of heaven. How do we relate those kinds of things to near-death experiences, or are they relatable at all?
Well, I mean, they probably are, because, I think these visions, in the case of saints like St. Philip Neri or St. Faustina, right, I mean, they're obviously, graces from God. And God absolutely can give us an impression of what, the life is to look like. And I mean, if I believe that near-death experiences do speak about a reality on the other side that people are visiting, which I do absolutely believe that, then, I mean, God can give us an accurate vision of it, an impression of it, an inner sense of it, or a downright palpable experience of it, if He wants to. And in the lives of saints, He does it frequently, not just, of course, with St. Faustina and St. Philip Neri, but a lot of different saints have had that vision or experience of the life which is to come. And some people, by the way, some of the saints too, dreamt it, but dreamt it so palpably, if I can use that word again. It was felt so real, right, that they awoke and actually believed that they had had an experience of actually being there. So yes, I would say, sure, very real possibility. It's God's grace, and God can give us whatever grace He wishes.
Very good. Just before we go, as the clock winds down, we find out the time is real, at least on this particular program and network. What is something called the Grayson scale? What is the Grayson scale?
Well, this is developed, there's a fellow by the name of Bruce Grayson, who's over there at the University of Virginia in the Department of Psychiatry and the medical school there, which, by the way, they do have a whole department that is dedicated to looking at transphysical activity there. And Grayson is associated with that department and kind of developed a scale of, the various kinds of, incremental things that would indicate, did a person have a near-death experience or that didn't have a near-death experience. And so, of course, if you kind of look at it and you say, well, you know, this person left their body, they did, you know, see things accurately and veridically, and on top of that, they did move to another domain, they did see the heavenly, they did have an experience of the absence of pain and the experience of beauty. They were greeted by a deceased relative who told them things, you know, that they didn't know before, which were verified after the fact, and then on top of that, they experienced a bright white light and Jesus or whatever it may be, and you kind of mount up all of these different things. You probably say that guy's a 10. You know what I mean? In other words, it's a you know, it's a certainty practically that he's had a near-death experience, and you know, and if it's lucid, if there's, you know, corroborating evidence for what he saw, corroborating evidence for what people told him on the other side, deceased relatives that he didn't know before. All of these things kind of add up to sort of a, you know, pretty certain thought.
Well, there you go, Father.
That as certain as one can have.
Perfectly. And I can tell your audience thinks you're a 10. Each week you do better and better. Thank you so much. And next week we're going to be talking about the evidence of God's existence. Is there physical evidence for Jesus' resurrection? So, you know, do your studying. We'll have some good, tough questions for you next week. See you. Thank you so much, Father. God bless. And, of course, the one and only Father Spitzer from the Magis Center. Check out his website, magiscenter.com. Check out all these wonderful books available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, including Finding True Happiness, Healing the Culture, 10 Universal Principles. They're all there to check out again. EWTN.com, EWTNRC.com. Don't forget Mother Angelica's book as well. Post your questions on Facebook. You can email us also through Twitter. And we shall see you next week as we once again venture into Father Spitzer's universe. I'm Doug Keck. Stay with us. Till next week.